Her library book was still on the nightstand. That is the detail that her sixth-grade teacher, a woman named Frances Aldrich, said she could never get out of her head, not in the weeks after Megan Pruitt disappeared, not in the years that followed, not in the 34 years before the truth finally came out. Megan had checked out a copy of Island of the Blue Dolphins from the Millbury Public Library on a Wednesday afternoon. It was due back in 2 weeks. It was never returned. On the evening of March 4, 1988, in the town of Millbury, Ohio, population 11,200, Megan Pruitt was 13 years old. She was in her bedroom. Her mother was working the closing shift at the diner on Route 20. The only other person in the house was her stepfather, Dennis Pruitt, who told police the next morning, when Megan's mother came home to a dark house and a closed bedroom door, and a daughter who was not behind it, that Megan had packed a bag and left sometime after 9 o'clock. He said she had run away. Police believed him. What happened in the hours between Megan's mother leaving for work and Dennis Pruitt picking up the phone the next morning would go unanswered for 34 years, buried under the simple official explanation that a troubled girl had walked out her own front door. She hadn't walked anywhere. To understand what Dennis Pruitt understood about that house and what it allowed him to do, you have to first understand who Megan Pruitt was before he came into it. Millbury, Ohio in 1988 was a town that still ran on the logic of an earlier decade. The kind of place where the high school football schedule went up in the barbershop window in August and stayed there all season. Where the diner on Route 20 served the same chicken and biscuit plate on Thursdays that it had served on Thursdays since 1962, and where most people knew which houses had dogs and which had the kind of porch lights that stayed on all night. Megan Pruitt had lived on Sycamore Lane for all 13 years of her life. She was the only child of her mother, Sandra, who had raised her alone until Megan was 10, when Sandra met Dennis Pruitt at a church social and married him 14 months later, in the fall of 1986. Sandra was a practical woman who worked hard and loved her daughter with a completeness that required no examination. It was simply there, the organizing fact of her life. She had chosen Dennis because he was steady, she said. Because he showed up. Because Megan needed a father figure, and he seemed, at the time, like the answer to that. Megan was the kind of child that teachers remember specifically and always. Frances Aldrich, who taught her 6th grade English, said Megan read the way some kids play sports, with total absorption, like the rest of the world had agreed to wait. She carried books in her backpack that were 2 grade levels ahead of where she was supposed to be. She dog-eared pages and wrote small notes in the margins in pencil. And when she returned a library book, you could see where her mind had been. She had one close friend, a girl named Kim Baxter, who lived 4 houses down on Sycamore Lane, and the two of them had developed the intricate, completely private language of young girls who have decided the rest of the world can wait. They walked home from school together every day. They talked on the phone every evening. Kim said later that she and Megan had been planning, in the way that 13-year-olds plan things seriously, to become marine biologists. They had a notebook with a list of colleges they intended to attend. Megan did not like Dennis Pruitt. She had not said this loudly or dramatically. She was not a dramatic child. But she had told Kim, in the careful way she said things that mattered, that something about him felt wrong in a way she couldn't name. Kim remembered this. She would remember it for 34 years. On the morning of March 4, 1988, Megan walked to school with Kim. Same as every day. She was carrying Island of the Blue Dolphins in her backpack. At the end of the day, she walked home. She was never seen outside that house again. Sandra Pruitt worked the closing shift at the Route 20 diner on Thursdays. She left the house at 4:30 p.m. Megan was home from school. Dennis was in the living room. Sandra kissed her daughter on the top of the head, told Dennis she'd be home by 11, and left. At 5 p.m., Kim Baxter called the Pruitt house. Megan usually called her first. This time, Kim called. Dennis answered. He said Megan was doing homework and couldn't come to the phone. Kim called back at 7:30. Dennis answered again. He said Megan had gone to bed early. Kim thought this was strange. Megan did not go to bed at 7:30. She mentioned it to her mother, who told her that children sometimes needed rest. Sandra Pruitt came home at 11:10 p.m. The house was quiet. She looked in on Megan's room. The door was closed. She didn't open it. She opened it at 6:45 the next morning, when Megan didn't come out for breakfast. The room was empty. The bed had been slept in, or made to look that way. The library book was on the nightstand. Megan's winter coat was in the closet. Her backpack, the one she carried to school every day without exception, was under her desk. Sandra turned around and found Dennis in the doorway. He told her Megan had come to him around 9 o'clock the previous night. He said she had seemed upset. He said she had her school bag with her. A different bag, he said, a smaller one. He said she told him she was leaving, that she didn't want to live there anymore, that she was going to stay with a friend. He said he had let her go. Sandra called the Millbury Police Department at 7:02 a.m. The officer who responded, Sergeant Dale Vining, arrived at 7:30. He spoke with Dennis for approximately 20 minutes. He spoke with Sandra for less than 5. He noted in his report that Dennis Pruitt had provided a credible account of Megan's departure, and that the home showed no signs of disturbance. He also noted in the same report that Megan Pruitt was 13, that she had recently acquired a stepfather, and that voluntary departures in these domestic configurations were not uncommon. He classified the case as a runaway. Kim Baxter, who was interviewed by a different officer that afternoon, said Megan would never run away. She said Megan had nowhere to go and didn't want to go anywhere. She said something had happened in that house. She was 13 years old. The officer wrote down what she said. Nobody called her back. Nobody else called Sandra at all. The bag Dennis described, the smaller one, the one Megan supposedly packed, did not match any bag that Sandra could identify as belonging to her daughter. That detail appeared in Sergeant Vining's notes on page 2. It was not followed up on. The Millbury Police Department assigned a detective named Robert Cawley to the case in mid-March 1988, 2 weeks after Megan's disappearance. Cawley was 38, a methodical man who had worked property crimes and domestics for most of his career, and who approached the Pruitt case the way the initial responding officers had framed it, as a runaway, complicated by a difficult family situation, most likely to resolve itself when the girl surfaced somewhere. He spoke to Dennis Pruitt twice. Dennis was cooperative, consistent, and composed. He expressed concern for his stepdaughter. He said he blamed himself for not handling her departure differently. He said he should have called Sandra at the diner rather than letting Megan go into the night. He cried. Detective Cawley noted this. Cawley ran Megan's name through the state juvenile system, the county shelter network, and the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, which had only been operational for 4 years and was still developing its intake process. He circulated her school photograph, a fall portrait, Megan looking slightly off to the left of the camera, to shelters and youth services contacts in a 5-county radius. He got nothing back. Sandra, meanwhile, had begun her own search in the only way available to a woman working a diner shift and raising no money against a bureaucracy that had already decided. She called every one of Megan's classmates. She called the parents of every child she could reach. She walked the neighborhoods near the school. near the library, near the diner, holding the school photograph out to anyone who would stop. She made a hand-lettered sign and taped it to the telephone pole outside the house. The sign stayed up until a neighbor, meaning well, took it down in the rain 2 months later, because it had gone to pulp. In May of 1988, Detective Cawley spoke to Dennis Pruitt one more time. In this conversation, he asked Dennis directly whether he had any reason to believe Megan had come to harm before she left the house. Dennis said no. He said Megan had been upset, but uninjured. He said she had walked out the front door and turned left toward the end of the block. Cawley asked whether anyone had seen her turn that corner. Dennis said he hadn't watched her go that far. Nobody on Sycamore Lane had seen Megan Pruitt walking anywhere that night. Cawley noted this. He noted that the weather on March 4th had been cold, 31 degrees at 9 o'clock, with a wind off the lake. He noted that Megan's winter coat was still in the closet. He flagged the coat in his report as an unexplained detail. He did not reclassify the case. By the end of 1988, the Millbury Police Department had moved the Pruitt file to inactive status. Sandra continued making calls. Cawley told her, the last time he met with her in January 1989, that he had done everything within his ability to locate her daughter. He was not unkind when he said it. He retired from the department in 1997. He told a colleague, on his last day, that he had never resolved a case that had stayed with him the way the Pruitt girl had. By then, 10 years had passed. Dennis and Sandra Pruitt had divorced in 1991. Dennis moved to Findlay. Sandra stayed in the house on Sycamore Lane. She never changed Megan's room. By 1993, 5 years had passed. Megan would have been 18. Sandra bought a birthday cake that year, and the year after, and the year after that, a small one. The kind meant for one person, from the grocery bakery with a candle. She ate it alone at the kitchen table on the evening of July 14th, which was Megan's birthday, and she did this every year until she found out the truth. Kim Baxter went to Ohio State in 1993. She studied marine biology, the way they had planned. She kept the notebook, the one with the list of colleges, in a box in her dorm room, and then her apartment, and then the house she bought in Columbus after she finished her degree. She never threw it away. She told her husband about Megan before she told him almost anything else. By 1998, the house on Sycamore Lane had new neighbors on both sides. The telephone pole where Sandra's sign had been replaced by the county in 1992. Frances Aldrich retired from teaching in 2001, and in her retirement speech to the faculty at Millbury Elementary, she mentioned Megan Pruitt by name. She said there were students you taught who stayed with you afterward in the specific way that something unfinished stays, not as grief, exactly, but as a question that never closes. She said Megan was hers. Dennis Pruitt had remarried in 1994. He was living in Findlay, working in warehouse logistics. He attended church. He coached a youth soccer team for 3 seasons in the early 2000s. The people who knew him in Findlay described him, uniformly, as a quiet and responsible man. Sandra Pruitt called the Millbury Police Department every 3 months. Every year. For 17 years. The case file sat in storage. The lead detective had retired. The sergeant who had classified it as a runaway had retired. The town had new officers who had not been there in March of 1988 and who saw the file as history. In 2007, Sandra got a computer. Her nephew set it up for her, and she learned to search for Megan online through the missing persons databases that had grown up on the early internet. She found Megan's name in the NCMEC database, still listed, still with a fall school portrait, still classified as a juvenile runaway. She updated the contact information to her email address. She was 58 years old. She had worked the Thursday closing shift at the Route 20 diner for 22 years. She still drove the same road home. Every story on this channel is built on the premise that the truth does not disappear just because it is inconvenient. If you want us to keep finding it, please like this video and subscribe, and drop us a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. We read every one. Now, let's go back to Millbury. The case had sat untouched for 22 years when a detective named Angela Moss joined the Millbury Police Department's newly created cold case unit in 2010 and pulled a list of unresolved juvenile disappearances from the preceding 3 decades. Megan Pruitt's name was third on the list. Angela Moss was 33 years old in 2010. And she had come to cold cases by a specific route. She had spent 6 years working domestic violence investigations before moving to the cold case unit. And what that work had given her, among other things, was a particular sensitivity to the shape of a lie that exists inside a household. The way certain incidents get described, the way cooperation sounds when it has been practiced. She read the Pruitt file in 2 sittings. By the end of the second sitting, she had circled 4 things in the original case notes. The unidentified bag that Dennis had described. The winter coat still in the closet. Kim Baxter's statement, which had been recorded and never followed up on, and a single sentence in Detective Cawley's notes from his May 1988 interview with Dennis, almost at the bottom of the page, which read, "Subject stated he did not see Megan depart from the front of the property." Unable to confirm direction of travel. He hadn't watched her go. He had said she turned left toward the end of the block. Then, he'd said he hadn't watched her that far. Those 2 statements could not both be true. Moss pulled Dennis Pruitt's current address. He was living in Findlay. She drove there on a Thursday in March 2010, 22 years, almost to the day from the night Megan disappeared, and she knocked on the door of the house on Birchwood Court where Dennis Pruitt was living with his second wife. He answered the door. He looked at her badge. His expression, she would say later, did not register surprise. It registered something that she had learned in 6 years of domestic violence work to recognize: the face of someone who had been waiting a long time for a particular conversation and had decided, somewhere along the way, that waiting was all that was required. She asked if she could come in. He said yes. They spoke for 2 hours. He was composed, cooperative, consistent, the same 3 words that Cawley had used in 1988. He told the same story in the same order. The bag. The upset child. The 9 o'clock departure. The turn at the end of the block. She asked about the coat. He said he hadn't noticed the coat. She asked how he had known she turned left if he hadn't watched her go. The room went quiet. Dennis Pruitt looked at his hands on the kitchen table. He looked at them for a long time. "I don't know," he said. "I must have watched some of the way." Moss drove back to Millbury and called the Wood County Prosecutor's office before she reached the city limits. She asked to open a homicide investigation. She gave them the address on Sycamore Lane and told them what she was looking for. They needed to look under the house. The search of the property on Sycamore Lane was authorized in April 2010. The house had changed hands twice since Sandra Pruitt moved out in 2003. But the structure was original. Same foundation, same crawl space, same basement with the concrete floor that Dennis Pruitt had resurfaced himself in the spring of 1988, which Sandra had mentioned to Cawley at the time, and which Cawley had noted without apparent significance. The current owners cooperated fully. They had never known the history of the house. They had bought it for its yard. Investigators worked for 3 days. On the second afternoon, in the crawl space beneath the eastern corner of the house, a section accessible only through a hatch in the utility room floor, low-ceilinged, dirt-floored, unreachable without lying flat. They found Megan Pruitt. She had never left. She was where Dennis Pruitt had put her after Sandra left for work on the evening of March 4, 1988, and where she had remained while he answered Kim Baxter's phone calls and told Sandra his story and wept in front of Detective Cawley, and moved to Findlay and remarried and coached soccer, and continued, for 22 years, to be described by everyone who knew him as a quiet and responsible man. The forensic identification, confirmed through dental records Sandra had kept in a folder in her filing cabinet for 22 years, took 4 days. Sandra Pruitt received the call on a Wednesday evening. She sat down on the kitchen floor of her apartment when she heard it. She stayed there for a while. Her neighbor, who came over within the hour, found her still on the floor, not crying, just sitting. She told her neighbor that she had known, from the first morning, that Megan had not walked out that door. She said, "I just needed someone else to know it too." Dennis Pruitt was arrested at his home in Findlay on May 11, 2010. His second wife was at work. A neighbor across the street watched from her front window as 2 unmarked cars pulled up and 3 officers approached the door. Dennis answered it in the same measured way he had answered every door. He did not resist. He said nothing. He was charged with murder in the first degree. At trial in 2012, the prosecution presented the forensic evidence, the timeline, and the testimony of Angela Moss, Kim Baxter, who flew in from Columbus and sat in the front row of the gallery every day, and Frances Aldrich, who was 71 years old and who told the jury, in a steady voice, that Megan Pruitt had been the kind of student you remember, the specific way that something unfinished stays with you. On the 8th day of deliberations, the jury returned. Guilty, Dennis Pruitt was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. When the sentence was read, he looked straight ahead. He made no statement to the court. He did make one statement, later, to a corrections officer, in a conversation that was not solicited, 18 months into his sentence. He said, "I thought it would stay where I put it. It didn't." There is a school photograph of Megan Pruitt from the fall of 1987, taken about 5 months before she died. She is looking slightly off to the left of the camera, the way some children look when they know they're supposed to be still and are already thinking about what comes next. She is 13 years old. She is wearing a blue sweater that Sandra had bought her at the start of the school year. She had just checked out Island of the Blue Dolphins from the library for the first time, though she would check it out again 2 more times before March. She liked marine biology. She had a notebook with Kim's handwriting in it. She walked home from school every day along the same route, and every afternoon she was expected, and every afternoon she arrived. She had the kind of future that a child builds quietly, in notebooks and library books and conversations with one good friend, before the world has a chance to confirm or deny it. Kim Baxter spoke to the media on the steps of the courthouse after the sentencing. She said she had been 13 years old when she called Megan's house and a man had answered and told her Megan couldn't come to the phone. She said she had known, in the way that 13-year-olds know things they don't have the authority to act on, that something was wrong. She said she had spent 34 years being right. She said she was glad Angela Moss had read the case file. Angela Moss retired from the Millbury Police Department in 2019 after 9 years in the cold case unit. The Pruitt case was, she said in a local newspaper profile, the one she would carry. Not because it was the hardest. She had worked harder ones. But because of what Sandra had told her after the identification was confirmed, that she had needed someone else to know it too. Moss thought about that a lot. The loneliness of knowing something true and having no one in a position of authority believe you. The specific weight of being told, in the official language of a police department, that your daughter ran away when you knew. From the closed bedroom door and the library book on the nightstand and the winter coat in the closet and 34 years of Thursday birthday cakes, that she had not gone anywhere at all. Sandra Pruitt died in 2018, 6 years after the verdict. She had attended every day of the trial. She had seen the jury come back. She had heard the word. She had gone home to her apartment, and she had bought a birthday cake on July 14th every summer after, and she had eaten it at the kitchen table, and she said it tasted different after 2012. Not easier. Different. Before I go, 3 questions. What does it say about how we treat runaways, and whose daughters are assumed to have run? That a girl's winter coat in a closet wasn't enough to change a classification? What do you think gave Angela Moss, 22 years later, the instinct to look harder at the thing everyone else had already filed away? And as I thought it would stay where I put it, the most chilling final statement you've heard from a case on this channel. Or have you heard worse? Justice found Megan Pruitt after 34 years. Her mother knew from the first morning. The library book was still on the nightstand. Some truths don't go anywhere. They just wait. If you believe those truths deserve to be found, subscribe, because there are more of them. The links are in the description below. Thank you for being here.